Part 1. The stranger at the fence expanded. The rancher first noticed her just as the sun was sinking low, bleeding orange and red across the wide western sky. It was the hour when the land went quiet, when cattle settled, wind slowed, and loneliness crept in if you let it. He usually kept busy then, finding small tasks to avoid going inside the house too early. That was when he saw movement near the old fence line at the far edge of his property. At first, he thought it was a lost calf. But then he saw her. She stood still, as if unsure whether stepping forward would invite trouble. Her coat was worn thin, the hem dusty and frayed. One hand rested protectively on the shoulder of a young boy beside her, no older than 6 or 7. The child leaned into her, his fingers curled tightly into the fabric of her sleeve, his eyes wide and alert. They didn't look dangerous, just tired. The kind of tired that came from too many nights without rest and too many days without certainty. The rancher stayed where he was for a moment, studying them. Life had taught him caution. Strangers came with stories, and stories often came with problems. Still, something about the way the boy stood, braced, like he'd learned not to expect kindness, pulled at him in a way he didn't like to admit. He approached slowly, boots crunching against dry gravel. "Fence is private land," he said, not unkindly. "You lost." The woman lifted her chin. Her eyes were sharp but exhausted, like she'd practiced being strong even when she had nothing left. "Yes," she answered simply. "We didn't mean to intrude." The boy didn't speak. He watched the rancher with careful intensity, as if memorizing him. The rancher nodded, glancing at the broken fence post leaning sideways, wire sagging low. "You can come inside the gate. Road's still 2 miles back." He paused, then added, "You look like you could use some water." Relief crossed her face before she could hide it. "Thank you." At the well, she drank slowly, savoring each swallow, then knelt to help the boy. He drank eagerly, spilling water down his chin, then wiped his mouth with his sleeve. The rancher noticed how she brushed his hair back afterward, checking him the way mothers did when they had learned the world was not gentle. "I'm Clara," she said once they were done. "This is Eli." "Name's Thomas," the rancher replied. He didn't offer his hand. He wasn't used to introductions anymore. He led them toward the house, the silence filled with the lowing of cattle and the creak of an old windmill. Clara walked cautiously, like someone entering unfamiliar territory without knowing the rules. Eli stayed close to her side, but his gaze drifted, toward the horses, the barn, the wide open land stretching farther than he'd probably ever seen. Inside, Thomas set bread, beans, and stew on the table. It wasn't much, but it was warm. Clara hesitated before sitting, as if expecting a catch. "You don't owe me anything," Thomas said, sensing it. "Just eat." She did, slowly at first, then faster. Eli ate like someone who hadn't had enough in days, though he tried to be polite about it. Thomas pretended not to notice. "Where you headed?" Thomas asked eventually. Clara shrugged. "Anywhere that'll take us." He didn't press. He knew better than to force words out of people who were still holding themselves together by thread. As night fell, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Thomas showed them the spare room, a room he hadn't used in years. Clara's eyes softened when she saw the bed, clean sheets folded neatly. "We'll be gone in the morning," she said quickly. "I promise." Thomas nodded. "Storm's coming. Best wait it out." Later, lying awake in his own room, Thomas stared at the ceiling. He told himself he'd done nothing more than offer shelter. Just one night, that was all. But somewhere down the hall, he heard a child's quiet breathing and a woman's whispered reassurance, and the house felt less empty than it had in a very long time. Outside, the wind howled across the open land, carrying with it the unspoken truth Thomas wasn't ready to face. Some strangers didn't arrive by accident. Part 2, the night that changed things expanded. Morning arrived quietly, wrapped in a gray sky that promised rain. Thomas was already awake, moving through his usual routine with practiced efficiency, coffee brewing, boots laced, jacket pulled on. He expected to find the house empty. He almost hoped for it. Fewer questions that way, but the spare room door was still closed. From the kitchen, he heard soft movement, the clink of a spoon against a pot. When he stepped in, Clara stood at the stove, stirring the last of the stew he'd left out the night before. Eli sat at the table, feet swinging, carefully lining up crumbs with his finger like they were something valuable. "I hope you don't mind," Clara said quickly when she noticed him. "I didn't want the food to go to waste." Thomas grunted. "It's fine." He poured coffee and sat across from Eli. The boy looked up, studying him the way he had the night before, quiet, thoughtful, as if measuring whether this kindness would disappear if he touched it too hard. "Storm's coming," Thomas said. "Road'll be mud by noon." Clara nodded. "Then we'll stay out of your way." That was how it started. Not with an invitation, but with weather and unspoken understanding. The rain came hard that afternoon, turning the land into a blur of gray and brown. Thomas went out anyway, checking fences and livestock. When he returned, soaked and cold, he found Eli waiting by the door with a towel that was far too big for him. The boy held it up silently, his face serious. Thomas hesitated, then took it. "Thanks," he said. Eli nodded, satisfied, and went back to his corner. Over the next 2 days, the rhythm of the ranch shifted in ways Thomas hadn't expected. Clara found things to do without being asked, mending a torn curtain, sweeping the porch, organizing shelves that hadn't been touched in years. She never assumed she belonged, but she moved like someone grateful to be useful. Eli followed Thomas everywhere. At first, Thomas tried to discourage it. Ranch work wasn't for kids. It was dangerous, unpredictable. But the boy stayed at a careful distance, watching, learning. When Thomas fixed the broken fence, Eli handed him nails from a small bucket, his tongue sticking out in concentration. "You ever lived on a ranch before?" Thomas asked. Eli shook his head. "But I like the horses." "So do I," Thomas replied, surprised by how easily the words came. In the evenings, they sat near the fire. Clara read from a worn book she'd carried with her, her voice steady and soft. Sometimes she stopped, lost in thought, and Eli would lean against her without looking up. Thomas watched from his chair, pretending to focus on mending tack. One night, after Eli had fallen asleep on the rug, Clara spoke quietly. "We don't usually stay anywhere this long." Thomas stared into the fire. "You don't have to explain." She nodded, grateful. "Still, thank you." The house felt different with them in it. Sounds filled spaces that had long gone quiet, footsteps in the hall, soft laughter, the clatter of dishes. Thomas caught himself listening for them when he woke, uneasy when the house was silent. On the third evening, the storm finally broke. The sky cleared, revealing stars sharp and endless. Thomas brought out a blanket, and they sat outside, the cool air heavy with the smell of wet earth. Eli pointed upward. "Why are there so many stars here?" "Because there's nothing blocking them," Thomas said. Eli considered this. "I like it." Clara smiled at her son, then at Thomas. "So do I." Thomas told himself, again, that it was temporary. People passed through. Lives moved on. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. Still, when Eli yawned and leaned against his arm, Thomas didn't pull away. That night, as the fire burned low and the land lay quiet under the stars, something shifted inside him, something he hadn't named in years. Belonging didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it arrived softly, stayed longer than expected, and waited for you to notice. Part 3, the question expanded. The fourth morning dawned clear and bright, the storm scrubbed clean from the land. Sunlight spilled across the ranch like a promise, catching on wet grass and fence wire, turning everything sharp and new. Thomas stood at the kitchen counter packing food into a brown paper sack, bread, dried meat, apples. It was what he did for travelers. A habit formed long ago, back when goodbyes were easier because they came quickly. Behind him, Clara folded the blanket from the spare room with careful precision, as if the way she did it mattered. Eli sat on the edge of the chair, boots already on, legs swinging. The house felt tense in its quiet, like it knew what was coming. "We'll head out after breakfast," Clara said softly. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded. Road should be passable now. He told himself this was right. Necessary. People didn't stay. They moved on, carrying their stories somewhere else. He'd learned not to ask where. Still, his hands slowed as he tied the sack shut. Outside, Thomas walked them to the gate. The land stretched wide and open beyond it, leading anywhere and nowhere at once. Clara adjusted the strap of her worn bag, her jaw set with determination. She met Thomas's eyes, and for a moment, the words she didn't say hung heavy between them. "You've done more than enough," she said. "We won't forget it." Thomas cleared his throat. "Take care." Eli lingered behind, dragging his boots through the dirt. He looked at the horses, the barn, the house, then up at Thomas. His face was serious in that way children got when they sensed something bigger than themselves. "Are you staying forever?" Eli asked. The question hit Thomas harder than any blow he'd ever taken. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple, honest, and devastating in its innocence. Thomas didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the broken fence he still hadn't fully repaired, the porch steps worn smooth by years of solitary use, the empty spaces inside the house that had only just begun to fill. He realized, with a tight ache in his chest, that this place hadn't been waiting for travelers. It had been waiting for people. Clara inhaled sharply. "Eli," she began, embarrassed, apologetic. Thomas raised a hand gently. "It's all right." He crouched in front of the boy, bringing himself eye level. Eli didn't look away. He was used to disappointment, Thomas realized. Used to answers that hurt. "I don't know yet," Thomas said honestly. Eli nodded slowly, accepting the truth for what it was. But he didn't step back. He stayed close, as if hope was something fragile that needed guarding. Clara wiped at her eyes, turning away to give Thomas space. "We didn't mean to. You didn't do anything wrong," Thomas interrupted. He stood, the weight of the decision settling deep into his bones. For years, he'd told himself he preferred the quiet. That loneliness was simpler than loss. But now he understood the lie he'd been living. Loneliness wasn't simpler. It was just emptier. Thomas looked at Clara, at the strength she carried without boasting, at the exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. He looked at Eli, who had handed him nails like they were treasures, who had offered a towel without being asked, who had looked at him not like a stranger, but like someone who might stay. "You can stay," Thomas said, the word surprising even him. "Not just for today, not just because you need to, but because I could use the help and the company." Clara stared at him, stunned. "Thomas, we don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said firmly. "This place has been too quiet for too long." Silence followed, thick, trembling. Then Eli smiled. Not a loud smile, not a grateful one, a relieved one, the kind that came from finally setting something heavy down. "Okay," he said simply. That evening, as the sun dipped low again, Thomas fixed the last of the fence while Eli held the wire steady. Clara cooked dinner, humming softly, her voice carrying across the land. The house filled with warmth, not just from the fire, but from laughter and shared stories. Thomas stood at the porch later, watching the stars come out one by one. He realized that helping a stranger had never been the point. Sometimes, the thing you thought was temporary was actually the beginning. And sometimes, home wasn't a place you returned to. It was a choice you finally made.